Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Mark Hamrick. I'm a broadcast journalist for the Associated Press. I'm the 104th president of the National Press Club. We are the world's leading organization for journalists, committed to our profession's future through our programming, events such as this, while also working to foster a free press around the world. For more information about the National Press Club, please visit our website at www.press.org. To donate to programs offered to the public through our Eric Friedheim National Journalism Library, you can find information on the website there as well. So on behalf of our members worldwide, I'd like to welcome our speaker and those of you attending today's event. Our head table includes working journalists as well as guests of the speaker, working journalists who are club members. If you hear applause in our audience, we'd like to note that members of the general public are attending here today, so it's not necessarily evidence of a lack of journalistic objectivity. I'd also like to welcome our C-SPAN and public radio audiences. Our luncheons are also featured on our member-produced weekly podcast from the National Press Club, available through iTunes. You can also follow the action on Twitter using the hashtag, using the search term hashtag NPC Lunch. After our guest speech concludes, we'll have a Q&A, and I'll ask as many questions as time permits. And now it's time to introduce our head table guests. I'd ask each of you here to please stand up briefly as your name is announced. So from your right, Mark Raimondi with Harris Corporation, NPC member, Director of Communications there. John Fales, a columnist with the Washington Times. Myron Belkind is our club secretary, and he is adjunct professor with George Washington University, former Associated Press bureau chief in London, Tokyo, and New Delhi. Lee Perryman with the Associated Press. He is director of broadcast technology. Mrs. Diane Jones, wife of General James Jones, our guest speaker today. Now moving over the podium, Melissa Charbonneau with Newshook Media, and she is the awesome chair of our Speakers Committee. Skip over the speaker for a moment. Pat Milton, investigative producer with CBS News, and she's a new member of the Speakers Committee. This is her first event today, and she organized today's event. Pat, thank you very much. Buzz Hefty is vice president of Van Scoyoc Associates, and he is a guest of the speaker. Andrea Stone, senior national correspondent with the Huffington Post. John Donnelly, senior writer with Congressional Quarterly covering defense and foreign policy issues, and he is vice chair of our Board of Governors. And Shannon O'Reilly, a new member of the National Press Club. She is with the Center for a New American Security. Please give them a round of applause. Our guest speaker today is a man who spent his life facing the most critical challenges one can imagine and handling them with grace and a steady hand. Those who know him point to his intelligence, his integrity, his calmness, his confidence, and believe it or not, his sense of humor. At 6'4", he played basketball for the Georgetown Hoyas in college and probably could have pursued a sports career. But he chose to follow in the footsteps of his father and his uncle and join the Marine Corps. And he had big shoes to fill. His father retired as a major, and in World War II, he was the first commander of Marine Corps Force Reconnaissance. That's the Marine version of Navy SEALs. All three, father, son, and uncle, ended up serving in Vietnam at the same time in the late 1960s. After the war, he was faced with a crucial decision. If he was going to have a career in the military, he would have to follow orders to Japan. And that meant leaving his wife and 4 children under the age of 6 behind for more than a year. That would be a huge burden for the family, but like most decisions in his life, he had married well too. His wife Diane took on that responsibility, and he would be forever grateful, and so is the nation. Not everybody who works hard and pursues his dream ends up as Commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps, and then Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, and then is chosen to be the U.S. National Security Advisor to the President of the United States, President Barack Obama. But there is only one General James Jones. General Jones has served his country selflessly and with distinction, and unknown to most people, General Jones many times used to ride his bicycle to work at the White House. That meant a pre-dawn 14-mile-long trip from his suburban Washington home, depending on the route chosen that day by his security detail. He speaks fluent French. He's a big fan of country music star Toby Keith. In fact, he had Keith perform for the Marines in Washington, where he urged him for the first time to sing his now famous hit, Angry American. Since leaving government and military service, our guest speaker has turned his focus to launching a consulting company, Jones Group International, and there he is confronting 21st century national security issues to improve U.S. economic competitiveness and to develop a comprehensive energy strategy. Of course, his areas of expertise are relevant to affairs of life and death, the most critical decisions that rise to the highest levels of government. And that's why we're so pleased to have him as our guest speaker today. Please give a warm National Press Club welcome to General James Jones.
Thank you very much, Mark, and it's a great honor to be here, and I want to compliment you on your choice of weapons. This is very impressive, and Marines like knives, and so depending on how aggressive the questions get, be forewarned, we're defending the podium. I am thrilled to be here, and I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to especially thank Pat Milton for her hard work in bringing this together. I've been asked to speak on the strategic implications of current and continuing developments in the greater Middle East. And fortunately, we have plenty of time to cover a subject like that, 20 minutes, which should be more than adequate to be completely superfluous in anything we talk about. But for those who thought that the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts were representative of how the 21st century was going to announce itself in terms of the type of conflicts that we would face, we've really found out quite recently just how wrong that thinking was. The rapidly changing strategic landscape, especially during the last few months, tells us that while it is very, very difficult to accurately predict the future, it underscores how crucial it is that we do our very best to assess the strategic implications of recent events and to not be distracted from the historical potential of what superficially appears to be similar, but which in reality are very diverse series of events. And while all of these events in North Africa and in the Middle East share some linkage, all are quite different and all retain their own unique character. I actually feel very sorry for my successor and the staff at the National Security Council for the amount of, for the influx in the number of issues that have just surfaced just in the last few months. And we owe them a great debt of thanks in the way they manage these things so capably. But it seems to me that what the recent events have in common is the awakening of an entire generation of young people in many countries. Young people who have come to the realization almost at the same time that absent major reforms in the way they are currently governed, their future and that of their children holds a little promise for them. They are aware, perhaps as never before, of the options that are available to people elsewhere in the world. And this awareness comes from a diverse number of sources. It comes from travel, it comes from the internet, it comes from the fact that some have been educated abroad in different countries, it comes from word of mouth. Whatever the source of this new awareness, it is powerful enough to change the course of history and to do so extremely rapidly. What we're witnessing in the Middle East and in the North African littoral in particular is perhaps the most significant historical event since the end of the Cold War. While some people claim that they knew that these social tremors were developing in several countries, no one could have predicted with any accuracy the spark that would cause the eruption of so many people almost simultaneously. One thing is sure. Even if this awakening movement stopped tomorrow, and it won't, even the most oppressive regimes on the planet have been put on notice. And while this is generally a good thing, it does present some special challenges for the United States and its leadership, not only in the region, but in the world. So the phenomenon of the events that are unfolding in North Africa for the past few months has relegated the traditional headline grabbers to lesser positions in our collective attention. Iran's nuclear project, a hot topic for 2009 and most of 2010, the Middle East peace process, our own national disengagement of combat troops in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, and other important events have taken temporarily, perhaps, but a lesser place with regard to our daily focus. But all of these remain as critically important as ever before, perhaps even more so. In Iran, for example, a country which still casts its menacing shadow over the entire region, inattention to the fact that just over 30 years ago, the fall of the Shah of Iran was supposed to lead to a more open Iranian society, but yielded just the opposite. We can be sure that the now temporarily quieter Iran is working extremely hard to ensure that the new Tunisia, the new Egypt, the survival of President Assad in Syria, the outcomes of the serious uncertainties in Yemen and Libya, the continuing failure to restart the Middle East peace talks between Israelis and Palestinians, and the so-called reconciliation of Hamas and Fatah all come out the way that they want. At the same time, the regime has continued its nuclear program unimpeded by global condemnation and so far by the sanctions that have been applied by the global community. Yet we can be sure that this regime has to be paying close attention to the popular movements going on around it, especially in Syria, where another oppressive regime is experiencing a popular challenge to its legitimacy to lead the nation. And as we watch the brutality of events unfold in Syria, we should be mindful of the strategic consequences of any solution to the current challenges to that government. Lebanon and Jordan both merit different but special attentions in this regard as well. The Middle East peace process, perhaps the longest-running major global issue of our time, the one that most people who have studied the problem and its history know with near certainty what the ultimate resolution will look like. It's just that no one is willing to take the first step in the process required to get there. How tragic. This is not to say that it is unsolvable or unresolvable, but it is to say the time is not on anyone's side. In fact, the inability to make even the smallest progress is hurtful to both sides and perpetuates an issue that affects not only the region, but a large part of the world. For the past few years, Americans, Arabs, and Europeans, to include Russia, have largely been in agreement with regard to what must happen in order to establish a Palestinian state and to satisfy Israel's legitimate concerns for its own security. But it hasn't happened yet. Senator George Mitchell's departure from the scene after a Herculean effort, for which our nation should be grateful, is not an indication that peace is at hand. And Iran is quite content with this development and this situation. The implications of a Fatah-Hamas reconciliation need further analysis, but initial signs are that this may not be helpful to the process either. Nearby in Iraq, the current flirtations of the Iraqi government with Iran is not exactly what we had in mind when the new Iraqi sovereignty was restored in 2009. Yet just a few weeks ago, on the 8th of April, uniformed Iraqi troops launched an unprovoked attack on a camp where several thousand Iranian expatriates opposed to the current Iranian regime had lived for many years. This attack on unarmed people, which U.S. forces protected from 2003 to 2009, resulted in 35 dead and over 200 wounded, including women and children. The evidence of collusion between Iraq and Iran to initiate this attack is strong, so the questions that should be asked of ourselves are becoming clearer as we withdraw our combat forces from Iraq. What have we really created in Iraq, and what will we have to show for the enormity of our sacrifice in the years ahead? In Egypt, when we look at strategically important countries, Egypt commands a unique regional position, and it is extremely important that Egypt not turn out the way Iran did 30 years ago. Fortunately, thus far at least, the Egyptian army has shown itself worthy of the trust of the Egyptian people as they move towards September elections. On this point, it is worth thinking about how the United States will relate to the new Egyptian government. From my perspective, it may be time to consider a bold idea which would demonstrate our welcome to the new Egypt by considering a type of Marshall Plan for emerging democratic states like Egypt and young Egyptians are trying to form. Such a plan would be international in scope, as the world has much to gain from any security, economic, and governmental assistance that can be provided at this critical time in Egypt's history. It would also send a clear message to people who currently may doubt our intentions, and it will limit the effort of radical elements who obviously want to create a totally different world, one country at a time. Egypt, of course, is foremost in their thoughts. So Egypt and what happens there in the near future is very much an inflection point that we should pay attention to. While we should, with regard to Libya, while we should applaud the speed with which the United Nations and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and to a certain extent the Arab League and the African Union, responded to the humanitarian issue and by obtaining a mandate to protect civilians through the imposition of the no-fly zone and the naval blockade, it does appear that the Gaddafi regime is fairly well entrenched and willing to take a long view with regard to this struggle. Strategically for the United States, Libya is not on par with Egypt in terms of vital interest, but how this crisis is resolved and when it is resolved is of great importance to us, to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, whose success, despite a quite limited mandate, will ultimately be evaluated against the regime's survival or its collapse. That may be unfortunate, but it happens to be reality. The crisis in which the U.S. plays a supportive role will also be influenced in large part by the Arab League and the African Union, whose early voices have been more forceful than expected, and hopefully this will continue. Certainly European interest in the outcome of this Libyan situation is very, very important, and for good reason. In Afghanistan, and by necessary association Pakistan, 2014 is now the year where President Karzai will get his wish to have full control of his nation's security, economy, and governance by that year. The path to that end will start this year in the withdrawal of some of our forces, and you can be sure some of our allies' forces is underway. This is encouraging, as the plan for transferring to Afghans control of each province one at a time as security, governance, and economic measures take hold is something that we've worked on for quite a while. This massive effort, which has taken its toll in many countries and at great cost, has come to the point that we cannot want for the Afghans that which they either do not want for themselves or are unwilling to fight for themselves in order to bring peace and a better way of life to that country. This was true in South Vietnam, as I discovered as a young 23-year-old second lieutenant, and it is true in Afghanistan. Their future destiny beyond 2014 will be up to them, just as President Karzai demanded at the London conference. They will have the means to chart their own destiny, and time will tell if they have the will. A word or two on Pakistan. Pakistan and the fate of Osama bin Laden are intertwined in the ultimate outcome for Afghanistan and the entire region. Bin Laden's fate and the fate of the majority of al-Qaeda's leadership over the past few years should serve as a clear warning to those who would lead such movements in the future. Like no one since perhaps Hitler and Stalin, bin Laden unified much of the world against his type of threat. The result is now clear. The world is safer because of the astounding progress made by the cohesion of operational and intelligence assets of many of our governments, who see this menace as an attack against us all. This is a major achievement which should not be ignored, where human, technological, and the need for rapid decision-making now permits us to be more confident that Osama bin Laden and others like him will fail. The fallout with Pakistan over the discovery of bin Laden's now operational headquarters near Islamabad will have important and perhaps long-lasting consequences. Pakistan has thus far resisted the offer of a long-term strategic relationship with the United States and other countries, which would help bring a better life for its citizens and a more peaceful region to its east and to its west. While Pakistan should be given credit for some incremental progress in rooting out some terrorists within their borders, notably in the Swat Valley and South Waziristan, which were both successful military interventions, the undeniable fact is that since their deeply flawed decision to not put their army along the border with Afghanistan, in 2006, thinking that the tribes would, in exchange for the army not being present, would patrol the border and prevent illegal crossings. Pakistan has become a selective safe haven for terrorists and terrorist leaders. And this fact alone has resulted in prolonging the efforts in Afghanistan and continues to cause us and our allies to suffer many more casualties and to deplete our national treasure at a time when obviously we can ill afford to do so. Like Egypt, though, the strategic importance of Pakistan cannot be overstated, and despite the current tensions between our countries over the bin Laden incident and with regard to safe havens, it is time to consider the possibilities that we can ensure that the conclusion to the hunt for bin Laden will become a starting point for a renewed effort to find the common ground on issues that we should all care about and that affect our collective security and our future hopes for regional peace, which will be to the betterment of Pakistan and its people and to the betterment of its neighbors on either side. Failure to capitalize in a positive way on this strategic moment would be a mistake of significant proportions. So, ladies and gentlemen, the pace and the importance of global events we witness each day is astounding. These events are forcing strategic decisions to be made at a more rapid pace than ever before. We will clearly need an increasingly more proactive engagement strategy to prevent future conflicts and to meet the challenges of our smaller, in terms of speed of activity, but more globalized world. The 21st century requires that we rethink the 20th century concepts of how we deal with the tectonic changes to the global landscape. American leadership and the ability to form appropriate and timely solution sets to the enormous diversity of global challenges will continue to be necessary, perhaps as never before. I'm very optimistic that this can be done. In times of crisis, America has always found the solution to its most serious and threatening challenges. May it always be so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and we'll begin with the questions coming from our audience. And obviously, Osama bin Laden seeming to be the most pressing news story of the past several weeks. That's the area where we begin. And on the question of Pakistan, how can the United States get Pakistan to be a more reliable partner? You talked about trying to make a renewed effort, but how do you get that going? The carrots and sticks, mostly carrots approach, haven't worked much so far.
Well, this is a puzzling fact. I know that President Obama and our entire National Security Council staff and the State Department and Secretary Gates, CIA, the whole structure of our government has been involved in working to try to overcome the hurdles that are in this relationship. One of the things that it's important to try to do when you deal with complex issues like this is try to understand how the other guy on the other side is looking at the same set of problems. And while we have made some progress, we certainly could not have done a lot of the things that we've achieved with regard to eliminating some of the al-Qaeda leaders and terrorists over the past 2 years with great success. We've also been helpful, I think, in addressing some of Pakistan's concern. We've come to their aid in times of humanitarian disaster. In 2006, an earthquake. More recently, major floods. But we still have not crossed that threshold where what we have proposed as a long-term strategic relationship, and all that implies, including economic development, people-to-people programs, the involvement of the whole of government, if you will, not just ours, but also a significant portion of the international community, applied to Pakistan's future in an expectation of really two things. One is to renounce the use of terror as an instrument of foreign policy, which most countries around the world do. And the other is to ultimately move against terrorist safe havens that exist. And as I said in my remarks, cause the rate of progress in Afghanistan to be more difficult and take longer than perhaps it should. So I think we'll have to wait and see how this plays out after all of the intelligence is analyzed, and there's a clearer picture of who knew what and when, and then to see if Pakistan and the United States can get together and maybe re-baseline the relationship and go into what is an absolutely strategically important relationship that will not only, the solution to which will not only affect and help Pakistan's future in the long term, but also provide for more stability in Afghanistan and to the east in India. We're fortunate to have Prime Minister Singh, who has taken personal risk along the Pakistani-Indian border to make sure that there's no provocation. But it's a sensitive time because another attack from Pakistan on India will be hard. It will be hard pressed to contain a reaction that would greatly destabilize the region. And Pakistan, I think, is acutely aware of that, and we've carried that message to them several times. So let's hope that now that the bin Laden hunt has been concluded, that we can build on the relationship and do the things that are absolutely important for our collective security.
So Senator Kerry, there for talks with the government, was quoted as saying we need to find a way to march forward if it's possible, and if it's not possible, there are a set of downside consequences that can be profound. He didn't elaborate on what those downside risks are. You talked about the upside, but what are the downside risks?
Well, I think I just touched on one. The downside risks are that any other attacks emanating from the territory where the government of Pakistan could have and did not move against a terrorist safe haven, and a successful attack is carried out in another country, whether it's Europe or the United States or India, it will be very hard for any leader to resist the hue and cry from the public to say, why don't you do something about this? And if and when that happens, that is very much the downside in terms of future stability for the region, and we will embark then on a new set of completely different parameters that we're working on now. So let's hope that, as Senator Kerry pointed out, that the upside of things can carry the day here. Logic would indicate that it should, and I think we should continue to try to understand Pakistani sensitivities and perspectives, and if we need to come to some agreements about what happened or didn't happen 10 or 20 years ago, let's get beyond this. We're worried about what's happening today and what's going to happen tomorrow, and that's what's important.
Questioner asks, how much were you involved in discussions in the White House about an intelligence lead in Abbottabad, and what can you tell us about what you knew about that?
Nothing. Now, this, I can say that, as has been pointed out by members of our government, that this was a long process. It started many years ago. The first real breakthrough came last year, and we made the decision, the President made the decision to exploit and develop this potential target, which turned out to be the last of the the last of the dry holes. And this wasn't a dry hole. This was where he was. But the effort that went into it is truly amazing. I think, as I touched upon, I think one of the unintended consequences of bin Laden's reign of terror, if I could use those words, are the degree to which intelligence and operational forces, not only in our country, but in many, many other countries that we work with every day, have now come together to create a situation where we are at least aware of where these movements are going. Whereas before we were chasing them and we would react to them, we have been quite successful in being quite proactive, not only in causing huge damage to the leadership structure of Al-Qaeda, but also anticipating and having a pretty good idea of where they're operating on the planet and what their intent is.
Questioner asks, what do you think about the use of interrogation techniques that reportedly led to the discovery of bin Laden's hideout, and should they be banned?
Well, this was a predictable consequence, I think, for both sides of the argument. My personal view is that I do not support the idea that the United States should be viewed for all of the values that we stand for as a nation that condones torture. And I'm going to let the debate will go on now as to what exactly was extracted and who knew what when, and I won't be involved in that. But I do think that the President's decision in 2009 was correct, and I think that this debate will continue, and we'll see where it goes. And I think it gets to the definition of what is torture and what isn't. But more to be said about that, I think, as the dialogue unfolds.
Okay. What are your thoughts about the U.S. Special Forces who carried out the mission to kill bin Laden, or ended up killing him?
Well, I think we're all in great admiration for all of our young men and women in uniform, wherever they are and wherever they serve. They are wonderful examples of our society. They're all volunteers, and some of them go into special forces. Each service has them. They are truly great patriots and heroic people that would not hesitate to make the ultimate sacrifice for the values and the causes we believe in, even for other countries. So I don't have the vocabulary to, I think, adequately express my admiration. I've been privileged to work with them for 40 years in uniform. I admire what they do, and I think in this particular case, it goes to show just how good they really are, and it's something we can be very thankful for.
I asked you earlier about, before we came down here today, about the relevance of apparently the operational involvement of bin Laden that we now know in retrospect. Could you talk about how that perhaps informs us about what has been going on and what it means about the potential for attacks in the future?
Well, I think that that while the degree to which, at least initially, if I read the reports correctly, that the degree to which he was involved may have been a surprise, but I don't think it's necessarily indicative that there's a major threat as a result of his involvement. He was always going to be the symbolic leader. We just had this image of him living in a cave and coming out at times to release a video or a documentary or to make some statement. We do know that bin Laden last year was personally involved in planning some so-called major attack on the European landmass. And as an example of our collaboration with our European friends and allies, we worked very hard and very long to make sure that we shared whatever intelligence we had with them and they with us. And in the course of trying to prevent that attack, we were able to, each country participating was able to really actually clean up some bad actors in different countries. And for reasons that I don't know, but I'm happy about, that attack never came off. And I believe that the fact that bin Laden is now no longer able to lead, he will inspire, but he won't be personally planning things. The fact is that we're probably all safer in terms of a grandiose event, a la 9/11. There will be probably some repercussions at the tactical level with poorly planned but pop-up type of revenge attacks. But there's no question, I think, that because of the way in which our intelligence organizations work and our operational forces blend and our willingness to transfer information very rapidly in order to thwart these kinds of attacks, that it's quite possible that this will be a defining moment in the war against terror. And I hope that it is.
And you said earlier that, and I'd just like to perhaps for you to elaborate on it a little bit about the remarkable extent now that you see the collaboration among nations on gathering intelligence that you said would not have occurred had it not been for 9/11. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, yes, I think that it was obvious that Al-Qaeda caused us to really reevaluate not only our own internal processes, the harmony that exists in the intelligence community, and how you measure, how you bring intelligence to the operators, and how you do that in a relatively secure mode, so you don't jeopardize the sources or the operation itself. Really had a transformational effect, that the benefits of which that we are reaping today. What goes on 24/7 around the clock in this capital and in others is astounding, and it speaks well, I think, to the passion to defend this country and others, and the rate in which we can convert useful technology into helping us to win this battle has been great, and the international community that's come together to make all of our borders safe is something that I'm sure bin Laden never thought about, but it is the consequence. It is a reality, and we should be thankful because this will apply not just against Al-Qaeda, but applies against all terrorist organizations that might have similar designs.
In that it's the 10th anniversary of 9/11 coming up, is there a danger that governments and people become complacent in that we haven't had a similarly serious attack since then?
You know, I would. We've had attempts. None of them have been successful. The one that worries me the most was the one that was the vehicle in Times Square that didn't detonate. But those of us who know about these things have concluded that that was really a successful attack. It's just that at the moment of detonation, the kinetic capabilities of the bomb did not work, and so many lives were probably spared. That caused us to really go back and work even harder to try to find out what we could do better to make sure that no attack gets that far. As the anniversary comes up, I think vigilance will. I can assure you that vigilance will be extremely high, and we should take nothing for granted. We're still not out of this, And while we can rejoice at this immediate outcome of the last 2 weeks, the threat is still there. It's still real. But thank God we have dedicated people who will not be lulled to being complacent. And knowing how the rhythms of the discussions on these issues in the White House, I can assure you that I don't think there's any chance that anybody will take their pack off on this subject.
So then the question's being asked about, does this change our commitment in Afghanistan that bin Laden is gone? And I know Secretary Gates has essentially said it's too early to ask that question, but obviously the question's being asked. So right now, based on what we know, what level and pace of troop withdrawals would you recommend? That knife's getting awfully close to your right hand.
We do when I finish around 2 o'clock, right? I actually really think that we have, since the NATO summit in Portugal in December, probably is a cohesive game plan in terms of the international community. And we have to always remember that we're not the only ones in this. We're the biggest player by far, but we're not the only ones who are paying a price for this, for our involvement in Afghanistan. Other countries are as well, and we should be grateful for their sacrifice and their effort. In December of last year at the Lisbon summit, the NATO summit, the countries agreed that we would honor President Karzai's request that he be in full control of his country, security, economic, and governance by 2014. The road to 2014 will start this year. I don't know what the recommendation will be in terms of, how many of our troops will leave, or how many allies will leave. I don't know a lot of the details, except for the concept that makes sense. At some point, Afghans, after all these years, are going to have to step up to the task. We, the international community, should continue to support them as best we can. But the decision has generally been made that by 2014, this will be, we are all shooting to making President Karzai's desire a reality. From a U.S. perspective, we have offered a long-term strategic relationship with the government of Afghanistan. We'll see how that plays out. There are certain things that we would like to see happen, I'm sure. We would like to see governance and rule of law become more paramount in that country. We'd like to see corruption decreased. We'd like to see some economic renewal. We'd like to encourage the international community, the business community, to invest in Afghanistan. But this will be a relatively short period of time between now and 2014 when all of these things will have to be put in place. One thing that is positive is the transference to Iraqi control of each province, one at a time, as each province shows itself ready to take over security, economic, and governance responsibilities, is an exciting program. And it's pretty straightforward. You can see it on a simple map. I'm told that effort is underway, and the progress that we're making is encouraging, just as the security investment that we made over a couple of years ago is now paying good dividends as well.
Questioner asks, what guarantee is there that when the U.S. forces withdraw from Afghanistan, that the vacuum of power won't be filled by radical elements?
Well, unfortunately, there is no guarantee, and just as there is no guarantee that Iraq, when we pull out, won't chart its own path. It might not be in total harmony with what we had in mind. We hope that's not the case. But one sure way to make sure that the linkages between these efforts goes the way we would like to see them, and that is to say, to provide a better way of life and more opportunity for the people of Iraq and Afghanistan, is to really take a holistic approach to not just security, but also economic investment and development, and also, to the extent that we can, influencing the government and rule of law reforms that the people of Iraq and the people of Afghanistan clearly want and deserve. And so it isn't just about the security aspect of things. You have to have security to establish a certain level of capabilities elsewhere in the society, but we should never take our eye off the fact that more needs to be done than just defeating Saddam Hussein or defeating the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. We learned that lesson in World War II with Germany, in Japan. Everywhere we have taken a more holistic approach to problem solving, we've done well. I just got back from South Korea not long ago, and you know, what a great success story South Korea is, one that all Korean war veterans should take great pride in. And that's the kind of ambition we have for other countries that we're trying to help, and that other countries are trying to help as well. And so let's hope that we can be successful, but let's also remember that we can't want this any more than the people themselves want it in the long term.
Well, and that's a great transition point to President Obama's speech that will deal with all these questions. So we had a couple of questions here. Essentially, what would you hope he can accomplish, and what would you advise him to include in that speech?
I thought I'd given this job up. Well, you know, on the issue of national security, it's clear that national security has a much broader portfolio than ever before. It includes cybersecurity, it includes economic issues, it includes things like climate, it includes things like energy in particular. I think if I were to make any kind of contribution in the future, it would be towards tackling not only our deficit and our economic situation, but critically our energy portfolio and how it's managed for the future. This is a truly 21st century problem that we're facing. It requires leadership at the highest level. I've used the analogy that President Eisenhower, when he had his vision for the highway system, really had a lot of opposition to the idea of building highways to nowhere in our country. And aren't we glad that he prevailed and gave us this fantastic road system that we have today. I liken the energy problem to the highway problem of years ago. We need an energy highway that takes us to a destination, and that destination includes harnessing the technologies that are available, analyzing the portfolio, making whatever organizational, structural reforms we need in our executive branch and legislative branch to create a really bipartisan approach to what I think is one of the most serious challenges that we face. The good news is that it's doable. It really is doable. Americans know how to do this. And the American people want this. It's not a question of reacting when the price for a gallon of gas is $4 or $5 and then forgetting about it if it goes below $3. This is a steady state problem that will affect us. It'll affect our next generation and the generation after that. It affects our balance of payments. It affects just about everything I can think of. So in addition to the president's many, many problems, I would hope that the administration can find the conviction and the time to turn to this particular critical problem, because it's not only important domestically, but it's an important component of how the U.S. will lead in the 21st century and the role that we will play on the global playing field on what is not only a national security issue, but an international security issue as well. Frankly, if you look at the emergence of if you look at the growing disparity between the haves and the have-not nations, one way that you can bridge that gap and have convergence instead of divergence is for the advanced societies to help the societies that are now, the governments that are now getting to that point where they have to choose between fossil fuels and not much else. We can help them jump that generation so that they don't damage the climate and they get to cleaner, more affordable energy sources in the future, and a greater variety of energy sources. The United States can lead in that effort, and while we can't do it by ourselves, we can significantly affect the global playing field with regard to energy in the 21st century, which is as important as anything else that I think that the President will have to take on in his remaining years in office.
Mm-hmm. So among the areas that one might hope there'd be bipartisan agreement in the Congress has to do with funding the operations of the government. With the budgetary pressures that are facing the nation now, it seems as if defense spending may have to be reduced. Where do you see perhaps the most rational solutions there?
Well, I think Secretary Gates has just been superb in anticipating this reality as early as 2 years ago. He started talking about the need to find economies of scale within the Defense Department and set about to do that. I think that what we're really talking about here is a reevaluation of kind of roles and missions, in the sense that the likelihood of a major peer rival level 20th century type conflict are probably pretty remote. But the likelihood of being asked to help shape the environment in different parts of the world are probably pretty high. But it's going to take a different organizational construct in terms of the types of forces that are used. And by the way, I think those forces will have to be used in conjunction with a whole of government approach, depending on what it is we're trying to change or affect. I think we have left the 20th century, which was, in terms of warfare, a reactive type of century. NATO was a reactive organization. I don't think we have the luxury of reacting and waiting a long time to react to things that we know are going to happen. And if you know it's going to happen, then perhaps you can affect the outcome by engaging earlier and with the right prescription, the right amount of aid, the right amount of training, the right amount of economic incentives, and a much closer working relationship between the public and private sector, I think is going to help us a great deal, and will continue to reinforce I think the destiny that all Americans want, is that in 20 or 30 years, we want to be a nation that is respected and admired and influential in the globe. It's going to be a different century, and therefore our response to different challenges is going to have to be different, and we're going to have to organize ourselves to be more rapid, to be more agile. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be doing things the way we did them in the 20th century, and that will apply to the Defense Department. And I think that Secretary Gates and the Joint Chiefs fully understand that. We've been through economic hard times, and in those times, the services did some of their better thinking. You don't tend to think too much if the money trough is completely unopen all the time, and you tend to just take it and use it. But when it tightens a little bit, that's when you really start thinking, okay, what do we really need here? What is it that we're trying to do? How do we organize ourselves? And how do we get through this period in a useful way? And I think what Secretary Gates has achieved is, and the President has supported his actions, has been to start that process so that it's not a surprise.
Mm-hmm. I asked you to be somewhat succinct in this next question, just because we're almost running out of time, but how do you feel like we're doing with Libya right now?
Well, I think that's an open question, and we all understand how we got in there. The President made a decision to forestall a humanitarian catastrophe, and largely succeeded in doing that. But putting your foot into Libya translated into the United Nations and NATO reacting relatively quickly for two organizations that are usually criticized for being too late, too little, too late, and too slow. And now it is a NATO operation. It's a NATO operation with a limited mandate to protect the population. And as I said in my remarks, I think it's still too early to tell, but it looks like Gaddafi is, at least has the wherewithal to ride this out for a little bit longer. But unfortunately, the judgment will be in the not too distant future, if Gaddafi still remains at the helm of his country, that despite that the mandate didn't ask for any kind of support to an overthrow, but to support the protection of innocent people, they will be judged against whether Gaddafi stays in office. That's just reality. It may not be fair, but I do think it's a little bit too early yet to see how this is going to play out.
We're almost out of time, but before we ask the last question, a couple of housekeeping matters to take care of. I'd like to remind you all about some upcoming luncheon speakers. On May 20th, Richard Trumka, president of AFL-CIO, will be our guest, and then May 26th, Juan Williams, a political commentator and Fox News contributor, will appear, in a sense, to reply to Vivian Schiller's speech from earlier in the year when she held the job as head of NPR about his firing. She addressed those issues then. Gary Sinise, on down the road, an Oscar-nominated actor, will announce the formation of the Gary Sinise Foundation. It's a charity dedicated to raising funds for charities supporting the military. I'd also like to remind you that on June 11th, the National Press Club hosts its 14th annual Beat the Deadline 5K race with honorary marshals Tony Horton of P90X and Suzanne Malveaux of CNN. Now, secondly, I would like to go through the tradition here of presenting our guest with the highly coveted NPC mug, and I might note that it is not as handy a weapon as the steak knife that we'll be happy to present to you as well, but we do appreciate that very much, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you.
My last question is about movies. What is your favorite film about war?
I have two. The first one is From Here to Eternity, and the second one is Sands of Iwo Jima.
Good choice.
And what I particularly like about the Sands of Iwo Jima was John Wayne and his role as Sergeant Stryker, when he was lecturing one of his Marines who did something wrong, and he said something that I've always used since I heard it, and he said, "Life is tough, but it's tougher if you're stupid."
That's good. That's great stuff. How about a round of applause for our speaker today? Thank you to all of you for coming today, and also to General Jones. And I'd like to thank National Press Club staff, including our library and broadcast center, for helping to organize today's event. And finally, a reminder that you can find more information about the National Press Club on our website. And if you'd like a copy of today's program, you can check it out at www.press.org. Thank you, and we're adjourned. That was great.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.